Let's light it up, written in the stars. Eat this! Decided by destiny.
I will have order.
So I don't know why, but for some reason 5-star supports are the most underrated category of characters. I swear people sleep on them like they overdosed on melatonin. Up until Zhongli buffs, the general consensus was that the only good 5-star support was Venti, and maybe you knew that wasn't the case, but the general population thought that Albedo and Zhongli were trash, and tons of people thought Jean was bad for a while too. Every time I hear someone get Mona, they complain about it, so I'm gonna show you how to maximize Mona's potential. I've been researching this for a while, and I've been talking with a ton of people on Mona mains to verify a lot of my information. First, I'm gonna explain how Mona's Q works, so that way you can find out why she's so good, and then we're going to move on to builds, weapons, and general tips. So let's start with how Mona Q works. There are multiple things that happen during this Q. The first thing that happens is Mona applies 2 debuffs, a bubble and Omen. The bubble debuff is basically a time bomb, and Omen is a debuff that increases damage dealt to the enemy, which makes it a numerically stronger buff than Bennett. On the skill menu, it lists Omen duration, and at a high level, it lasts for about 5 seconds. However, the Omen duration timer doesn't start ticking until the bubble pops. So when you apply the bubble, the Omen debuff is happily vibing. It's not going anywhere. If you've ever played Overwatch, think of Zenyatta's Discord Orb. The second thing that happens is the bubble will ensnare any small enemies without buffs or infusions. In order to pop the bubble, you just need to deal any sort of damage to it. When the bubble pops, it does the elemental burst damage for Mona, and the Omen timer begins. It's important to note that any damage that pops the bubble and the bubble itself will gain the Omen damage bonus. So to explain that to you in action, let's pretend that you wanted to buff Mona's damage and use Bennett to vaporize. It's important to know that when Mona applies her Q, it applies Hydro and will vaporize with no damage if the enemy has a pyro debuff on them already. So what that means is that the bubble won't pop, but you'll remove all statuses from the enemy. So the order would be Bennett Q, Mona Q to remove the pyro debuff, and following that you would wait a couple seconds for the internal cooldown. It should be roughly 2.5 seconds. Then you would use Bennett's E to go ahead and pop the bubble, and what that would essentially do is it would apply pyro right before the bubble pops, because the bubble pops after the hit is taken, which would apply hydro and get the vaporize off for Mona. Remember, Mona's hydro application always happens after the bubble is popped. So you have the initial hydro application as soon as you press Q, and the following hydro will be after the bubble. This looks a little bit different if you want to buff your carry. Basically, you would just have to make sure that Mona's bubble doesn't pop with Bennett's Q. So you would use Bennett's Q away from the enemy to not apply that pyro. You'd use Mona Q to apply Omen and hydro, and then as an example, you could react using Diluc, Hu Tao, or someone like Zhongli. Essentially, that's the simplest way I could explain it, so if you need to go back and review just so you know what you're doing, you are able to skip to that timestamp. Now that you know how our bubble works, we're going to move on to artifacts. For burst damage purposes, Noblesse and Wanderers is going to be the best set for reaction damage, mostly because Wanderers gives you that 80 elemental mastery, and Noblesse gives you 20% more damage on your Q than the next set we're talking about, which is the 2-piece Noblesse and 2-piece Heart of the Depths sets. 2-piece Noblesse and 2-piece Heart of the Depths is the best for general use because it brings you highest damage on Q without reaction, and you're getting 15% hydro damage bonus and 20% Q bonus. There's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of depths of these sets because it is literally just damage bonuses. As for the other sets, you do have the option of Heart of Depths and Wanderers, which is a pretty flexible option if you plan to use her as a DPS, but I would argue that 2 Heart of the Depths to Gladiator or 2 Noblesse to Gladiator is better. All 3 of these options give you a little bit more flexibility if you want to do some extra damage with Mona outside of her Q, but you'll miss out on a lot of damage on the big burn numbers, so I would suggest using these sets as fillers just while you're farming the rest of your sets. To be honest though, substats can make more of a difference in Mona's burst than sets sometimes, so that's something to keep in mind, because if you have a full Gladiator set with really strong crit and elemental mastery, you may actually see better results for damage with that. Moving on to a burst support build, the difference here is that a burst DPS is meant for Mona to be doing a bunch of damage for herself, and the burst support build is meant to support your other character that's going to react with Mona's bubble. Essentially, you're just going to run 4-piece Noblesse because you're going to use this to buff your carry when you switch off of Mona. However, if you are already running 4 Noblesse on another character, don't use 4 Noblesse on Mona. Use one of the other burst DPS builds because 4-piece Noblesse bonuses do not stack. Now that you know which sets to run though, let's talk stats. Stats will actually vary on whether she's meant to hit big numbers herself or buff your other characters, so keep that in mind. If you're trying to do big numbers with Mona, you want to use attack percent or elemental mastery Sands, hydro damage Goblet, and crit damage or crit rate Circlet in order to get the best damage. And we'll talk about attack or elemental mastery in just a second. But if you're trying to focus on buffing your team, you should focus on energy recharge, hydro damage, and crit damage or crit rate. While Mona's Ascension 2 buffs her hydro damage by 20% of her energy recharge, she does already get energy recharge on on Ascension, so it's not completely necessary for a build where you're trying to do max damage with her, but if you're trying to have her Q up as much as possible, it is really helpful to put that on the Sands. And if you're wondering, no, building energy recharge does not outscale attack or elemental mastery. For substats, you're going to be looking for crit rate and crit damage, attack percent, and elemental mastery or energy recharge, and you can prioritize attack, elemental mastery, or energy recharge based on the build. You'll notice for the burst DPS side of things, I recommended elemental mastery or attack, and here's the argument for both. Without Sucrose, elemental mastery in a vaporized comp is going to be better than attack if you're trying to get max damage, because elemental mastery has fall off, but without Sucrose passing along her elemental mastery, you will actually benefit a lot more from getting that extra damage when you're reacting. But if you are using someone that buffs your elemental mastery, maybe in a one-shot build or something like that, then building attack will be more important because you do want Mona's attack stat to be higher, so that way she's able to combo for more damage. And again, elemental mastery falls off after a little bit. Essentially, it's going to be easier for you to have damage fall off with elemental mastery than it would be for attack if you're running other characters that buff your elemental mastery. For consistency's sake though, attack is a very safe bet. So if you want to play it safe, if you're not consistently reacting, or you're maybe a little unsure of what your elemental mastery values are going to be like, just go with attack. It's a safe bet. Now that we know all about artifacts and stats, we can move on to weapons for burst DPS. Honestly, it's pretty hard to rank these weapons because most of what you're looking for with Mona is main stat, but some passives outweigh the main stats. So I'm going to list the best weapons for her, but order will depend on what your artifacts and purpose for Mona are. For burst DPS, Widsith is best in slot because of its passives. Two of its passives are ideal for Mona because one buffs elemental damage and the other buffs elemental mastery. The attack buff is super good too, but you're going to see a little bit lower results with the attack buff comparatively to the elemental mastery or the elemental damage buffs. As far as 5-star weapons go, the crit rate from Lost Prayer makes it really powerful, but the elemental damage bonus from Skyward Atlas is also very good. Both of these weapons are pretty viable. I would actually lean towards Skyward Atlas for this one just for the elemental damage bonus. And then for free to play, you have Mapamare as a super useful tool for vaporized comps because it has elemental mastery as its main stat, and if you leave Mona on the field, it allows her to be more flexible and deal slightly more damage. I would 100% recommend Mapamare if you don't have Widsith or either of the 5-star weapons listed, and if you do run Mapamare, definitely run an attack percent Sands and not an elemental mastery Sands. Following Mapamare, we have Solar Pearl, Eye of Perception, Frostbearer, and Blackcliff. All of these weapons are super great for Mona as a DPS, but they're definitely more suited for her as a DPS that remains on the field, like a main or sub DPS. Definitely less effective for burst, but not the end of the world. If you just got Mona and you're in early game, I'd recommend using something like Emerald Orb or Otherworldly Story until you get access to a better weapon, but hopefully you'll be able to make Mapamare soon enough. And if you're using her as a burst support, just give her Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to buff your carry's attack more. That's essentially all you need to build her. However, I do have some really important tips for you. Vaporized comps can be super fun, but you can also use a freeze comp with characters like Kaya or Ganyu and extend your Omen duration to the duration of your bubble. We're not sure if this is a bug or not, but it's been around for a long time. Bubble can last up to 8 seconds, and for some reason, if you keep enemies 100% frozen, the bubble won't pop as long as the Cryo and Hydro Infusion don't leave. Essentially, this lets you get the extra Omen damage bonus for the full duration of the bubble of 8 seconds, and then the Omen timer would begin, so at max level, you could get up to a total of 13 seconds on your Omen damage bonus. The one thing to make sure of here is that you have to apply Cryo before you use Mona's Q, otherwise the bubble will pop when you use an elemental reaction on it. However, if you're using Cryo or Hydro against a frozen enemy, for some reason it won't pop the bubble. So definitely take advantage of that if you're using her as a DPS or if you have a Cryo DPS. Another tip that I have for you is that if you don't have Diluc or Hu Tao, I'd recommend making her a burst DPS over a burst support, and here's why. To get the most out of her as a burst support, you need to have a reaction pop her bubble, and that reaction needs to have really high scaling. As of right now, the only reaction with a high multiplier with Hydro is Pyro. Hu Tao and Diluc are the only two characters in the game right now that had that super ridiculously high scaling. So essentially, if you don't have one of those two, I would recommend just building her as a burst DPS so that she herself could do most of the damage and it doesn't require that much for activation. Anyways, that about sums up my Mona guide. So if you've learned anything or if you liked the video, make sure to go ahead and like and then subscribe down below if you want to see more Genshin Impact guides and content. I also go live on Twitch a couple days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, and our Discord and other social links will be in the description. So if you want to come hang out, make sure to go follow those or join those. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a wonderful day.